Tuesday afternoon, everyone. Thanks as always for your time, both in preparation for these meetings and in participating in the meetings themselves. Just always impressed at the level of discussion we're able to have. Excuse me. This is meeting number 22. Last meeting, we had our first discussion focused on urban reserves, and I know we'll revisit that conversation down the road a little bit. Today, we are revisiting two topics that we've talked about in the past. The first topic of the day will be development-ready lands inventory and capacity and sufficiency. So Madeline will lead us through that conversation. And then our second topic for the day will be partially vacant lands and the land market supply factor. Karin's going to lead us through that conversation. So we'll hear brief presentations today on each topic. Then we won't, since we've already talked about these issues, we won't do clarifying questions. We'll just go right to a quick poll. Hopefully we'll see more ones than twos and threes this time, right? That's the goal, is that each time we get a little closer to hitting our mark. And then we'll have discussion. So with that, I believe, Karin, you're introducing our focus area and questions from the racial equity framework for today.
Yeah, I think it's been a little while since we've done our data equity and data justice, and it seemed appropriate with these topics that are pretty heavy on collecting data, analyzing that data, and summarizing it. So we have a few questions to keep in mind as we're getting through our discussion today. And on the next slide, I'll just walk you through what questions we've prepared for you. So when we think about jurisdictions with varying local contexts and how we equitably create rules that work for different types of jurisdictions of different sizes, what are some of those challenges and burdens that our different jurisdictions have? And not just to think about the challenges, but think about solutions. If there were a universe in the future where the state could provide resources to counties or to councils of governments to help small cities with their data collection, maintaining their data, and then being able to aggregate their data, analyze their data, and pull results from their data. What would that look like? And do these data help us understand the impacts of planning for housing for communities of color and underrepresented communities, under-resourced communities? What unintended consequences could potentially come from data sensitivity, thinking about data justice and how we're responsible and responsive with that data. But then really dialing down to, do jurisdictions have the data available to them? Is the data accurate and reliable, and to what degree? And is the data also serve a purpose for a proxy? That there may not be perfect data, it may not be data that is exactly or directly related to the research questions or to the policy development, but we have proxy data that could serve a purpose and help inform and educate policy decisions from decision makers and from practitioners and program staff. So how can we better obtain this data and provide access to the data? And what is the data we need? Who has it? Who doesn't? Who needs assistance with it? Who needs support or technical assistance, or even funding and resource assistance? So if we could keep those questions in mind, I think we will move through our discussion today.
Thank you, Karin. All right. Madeline, please talk to us about development-ready lands inventory.
Thanks, Steve. If you could advance one more slide, I think that's where we're headed for. Thank you. Today, we're going to revisit the rule language related to development-ready lands and focus on the elements of those rules related to capacity and sufficiency. In your memo that accompanied some of the material in your packet, you'll see that there are some highlighted topics, just to run through them quickly so everyone has them fresh in their mind. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between minimum density and achieved density as qualification for being land being considered development ready. We're going to look at development ready land inventory as a tool, sort of bigger picture, zoom out and think about the development ready land inventory as a tool to revealing where there are imbalances in the landscape for development opportunities for housing, and think about those places as opportunities for investment. particularly to direct our attention not just to what qualifies or doesn't qualify for development readiness on the map, but what does a city do about it? And then finally, where the contextualized housing needs element of a jurisdiction's housing program comes in to play in order to gauge sufficiency of development ready land. And I've got a fairly lengthy, apologies for the length of the question, but I just wanted to keep this question fresh in your mind about thinking about how the refinements that we're making today, how they might help jurisdictions leverage tools such as land use tools or investments in order to realize housing production, particularly in this shorter housing production strategy window. So please keep that at the front of your mind as we're working through the overview of some of the changes that were made at many TAC members' requests, and be thinking about that as we get into the latter part of the discussion around development ready land inventory. Thanks, Jenna. If you can move to the next slide. So just as a refresher, we're talking about development ready land, and again, we're hoping to not create more analytical burden for cities as in jurisdictions that are performing this inventory, that might find ways to streamline the inventory work that's required in statute, and to do so, the inventory will mirror in connection with the language in statute will mirror the buildable land inventory. So you'll see 270, 280, and section 335 of 197A. There's a typo on that slide. Apologies. It's 197A 335. And again, at your April 17th meeting, so about 2 months ago, we discussed this, and the consensus from the group was that development ready land ought to be measured both in acres and in housing units, because again, remember that development ready land and its inventory are responding to the housing target that a jurisdiction is given by DAS. So this is the target will be in units of housing, and the buildable land inventory, again, as you're all very well familiar, are measured in acres. And so to remain consistent with that, you'll see references in the language in attachment A, along with some references in the memo to development ready land measured in both ways. And again, that's going to assume not just the capacity allocation that's typically identified in a buildable land inventory for certain land, and that's done in achieved density, but also in the housing type mix that's also part of a buildable land inventory. So I wanted to just make sure that that was abundantly clear to this group. Again, it's meant to parallel and streamline this inventory to be consistent with buildable land, though, again, the development ready land inventory does not inform a city's need for acreage when it comes to their housing allocation. So that 20-year time frame, we're still talking about the shorter timeline of 6 to 8 years of the housing production strategy. Secondly, and perhaps most importantly, my hope is that some of our discussion today will focus on how the development ready land inventory can help a community. Not just whether or not parcels show up on a map, but how do the results of this work inform the choices a jurisdiction can make to produce housing, particularly housing that responds to their contextualized housing need. One of the ways that you all described, and going back in the archives of our discussions back in September of 2024, so if anyone can remember that for that far back, I give you kudos, but there were a few really great nuggets of conversation in that meeting, particularly related to investment opportunities. And I'll get back to that in a few moments, but to think very deeply about how a city uses this new tool of a map that shows where investments are opportune in order to activate certain land. Next slide, John. Just a refresher too, we've talked a lot about the definition of development ready land, but to go back to the statute and what drives our discussion today is not just what is development ready land and how does it show up on a map, but also when does it occur? So the development ready land inventory is meant to occur at the time when a buildable land inventory is performed. In this, I'm interpreting, and I think our team is interpreting, that there's an economy of scale by performing the development ready land inventory while doing a BLI. So this is an opportunity for us to provide consistent methodology between the two, and to use the jurisdiction's housing type mix to arrive at some unit assumptions. So I'd be happy to dive into that in our discussion today if that's of interest. And then secondly, and most importantly, development ready qualification. So I'll start by saying that I heard the group in April discuss the difference between minimum density of a particular zone and achieved density of a particular zone. And as proposed initially, the language in the draft rule said achieved density is the qualification for development readiness. And you all pushed back on me and said, actually, if a parcel can achieve its minimum density, it's ready for development. That said, we went back to the drawing board as a team and thought about what might that result in terms of outcomes, some intended, maybe some unintended. One of the unintended outcomes of measuring development readiness by minimum density is a disparity between the density and therefore units of capacity that land has, if measured in the BLI at achieved density, and yet qualified in the development ready land inventory as minimum density. And this opens up a question perhaps of almost implicit overcounting of capacity of land in a number of instances. So let's use an example. A parcel of land has a minimum density requirement of 5 units an acre, but it's maybe a density range of 5 to 15, and the achieved density of that zone is 10. So in the buildable land inventory, that 1 acre of land is going to be counted as having a capacity of 10 units. However, its minimum density to be able to build something is 5, and we've lost 5 units in this discrepancy. And I want to make sure that we're going into that the discussion of whether to use achieved density in the development ready land inventory or the minimum density as the qualifier for development ready, with eyes open, to understand that is an implicit instance of creating or creating phantom or paper capacity that we may not be able to recover, or we may need to may need in that instance to require cities to report both the capacity as listed, especially in those perhaps capacity limited areas, versus the opportunity of saying, if that land can't be qualified as development ready, then perhaps there's an opportunity to highlight areas where land can meet the minimum, but it's limited in capacity, and it necessitates that cities do something about it. And that's, I think, where I want to focus our energy, is thinking about how might land show up on a map in a way that requires a city, if it truly can't achieve its achieved density, the density that all other land zoned in that similar way has achieved, then ought a city be obligated to take steps to remedy that? Or is meeting the minimum density enough? Kevin, if you don't mind, I'm going to finish. I've got one more slide, and then I'm happy to direct to you if you have a clarifying question on this. Jenna, if you could go to the next slide, please. And then finally, I think the big penultimate, what is enough? How much is enough in this case? is an opportunity to think about the second part of 197A 210, which tells us that a jurisdiction must prepare lands for development or redevelopment or increase the capacity of existing development ready land. So this again speaks to not just adding more land to the inventory that qualifies as development ready, but thinking also about how existing land that is ready, i.e. it's served and it's unencumbered and it's zoned appropriately to allow for residential use, but that there's also a question of increasing its capacity. So that opens an opportunity for jurisdictions to think deeply about efficiency measures that might increase the amount of immediate or near-term development capacity of existing served land. And finally, you'll see in the last sections of some of the language changes in attachment A that there are references to a city's contextualized housing need. This in the context of what we've seen as a goal 10 process as part of that first part of an old HNA, which was to identify what the needs are of a community. That need identification is greatly expanded by the rules that were adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission in December of last year in 2024. And there will be a fairly robust evaluation of contextualized housing need, which will specify not only a variety of characteristics, but also types and locations that a jurisdiction might need to pay very close attention to and provide some level of satisfaction of in order to say that this is the amount of land that is appropriate for particularly the types of housing that are identified as needed in that community. And there are some references to that in the language that I'd be happy to unpack and discuss if folks have questions about them. And then lastly, before we get into your quick question, Kevin, I've got one item that's sort of a lingering item that we haven't addressed. Jenna, my colleague, has presented on buildable land inventory work and constraints in recent past meetings. And one of the elements to that consideration you'll see at the very conclusion of the memo has to do with the term cannot be served as part of the definition of buildable land. And I wanted to at least acknowledge one, that we've searched through a variety of methods, both anecdotally with practitioners and in statute and in rules for grounding as to what constitutes cannot be served. Most of, just to quickly summarize, folks in the engineering community will tell you that there's very little with an infinite amount of resources, of course, financially and otherwise, anything can be served. The question is it practical? Is it likely to happen based on the capacity or need of that acreage or space that's buildable per the definition? And you'll find that the answers quickly change, that not everything is buildable or able to be served in the sense that the relative cost would outpace the value of installing utilities. In this case, we're hopeful that we can provide some remedy through guidance that we can speak to. You'll see there are 3 options or 3 directions that a jurisdiction could go in if in fact there are challenges related to ability to serve a property. And by that, we're speaking about relative, almost embedding relative likelihood of being served as a way to describe that. And there are at least a few remedies. One is that land could be swapped, given the sort of revamped work around UGB swap opportunities. The land could be discounted because of constraints that perhaps hem in the property. Typically, those are topographical or physical, among other things. And then thirdly, there are still lingering islands of buildable land that truly are are within a city, within the confines of a city, they cannot be swapped. Their ability to develop is severely limited. And I think there are some good examples out there of cities that have discounted that land, or taken steps within their work around constraints to disqualify that land as buildable. And so I would hope that that's something that we can, if we need to, come back to in guidance. But there's not, there hasn't been a clear or evident approach to disqualifying land from being buildable because it cannot be served per the definition in Division 8. So I just wanted to bring your attention to that component in the memo, but not to distract or dissuade your comments from speaking to the language related to development ready land, its capacity and sufficiency. So I'd open it, Kevin, first to your question, and then we can move into the poll.
Thanks. And it's really just a clarification. I want to be clear about when we use the term minimum density, understand that not all cities do have minimum densities or enforce minimum densities with development. And so if we will use that term in rule, we will need to be clear about, is that what we mean, or do we mean differently? You might have a comprehensive plan designation for low density residential with the range, let's just say it's 4 to 8 units per acre. And if 4 is the minimum density, that's just sort of like what we're thinking the minimum density might be. But it is different than what a local government actually requires. So just a nuance on that term. I'm not advocating for use of that term because it is kind of variable, but that's a consideration. That's it.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, let's go to the poll. Ingrid. All right, what do you think about the revised draft approach? Did we hit the mark? Are we getting closer, or do we still need more discussion and revision? We got 9. I think we have 12 people who might be weighing in. There is 11. Okay. All right. Well, we have 5 people saying support as is, 5 saying support with minor refinement, 1 saying needs more discussion. So that is, I'll take that as progress. We're moving in the right direction. Can we have, if the person who gave it a 3 is willing to speak up, that would be great to hear from them, but certainly happy to hear from anyone. And I'll also just pause here. I think this is a good example of a topic that touches all of our members, cities, counties, metro, service providers. So, I'm very thankful for the folks who speak up at all of our meetings and want to encourage them to continue to do that. But I also want to make sure we're making space for folks who don't weigh in with their comments as often. So, so encouraging those folks to maybe chime in here to kick us off if you have a comment you want to share. So I'm just going to wait for a second here to see if any of our not as common voices want to make a comment. You know who you are. All right, Cassara, that's perfect.
I know you're talking about me. Well, first I want to thank Maddie for kind of unpacking the difference between the minimum and the achieved density. I was perhaps one of those questioning why we would look at or exclude those properties from the development ready lands. But I think in the memo, also your statement saying this isn't connected to goal 14, that just helped things click for me. So Ideally, I would like to see cities and counties provide both so we can understand, is development happening in these areas that are meeting minimum but not achieved. But I think at the end of the day, making sure that this is not turning into a barrier to do the data crunching for cities is probably what's most important. And consistency with the BLA.
Thank you for chiming in. I appreciate it. Brock.
Yeah, thank you. I was the three, if there was an option in between, I'd 2.5. But I think the distance from the property line of 300 feet, I think could probably be reduced to 200. I'm just thinking like city block length, right? In downtown Portland, for example, that's the city I reference the most because I grew up there, right? Block length is about 200 feet. And I just say that for like visual context, if you can imagine that, that's means you got to go a block and a half. There might be cases where that's totally feasible. There might be cases where it's going to add a lot of cost. The current DRL inventory rule under B 1B2, I guess, still uses achieved, and I think it's important that that be minimum. We are already far behind, and we're further behind than we were last year, and we're even further behind than we were the year before that. And so I think if we're waiting for it to reach achieved density before it's considered development ready, it's just going to take more time that we frankly don't have. But I do think this is an improvement from where we've been in the past.
Thank you, Brock. Martha?
Thanks. Sorry, you'd think I'd know how to use this system by now. I agree. And I do think that I appreciate the work that you've done on this. I think this is a whole lot closer. And I was a 2, I still have some comments and potential tweaks. But I also would agree with the use of minimum density or whatever term we end up using. I understand Kevin's point that that may not be, it could be minimum density or some description of like a percentage of achievable density, achieved density or something like that. I think it's important to keep that in there because I think it's important, like development ready lands are development ready, right? The amount of capacity they get is a different calculation. And in the example that you gave from 5 to 15 units an acre with an achieved density of 10 units an acre, if we only look at those that can get 10 units an acre, I mean, what if there's 20 lots out there that can get 5 units an acre? That's 100 dwelling units that you're not potentially counting toward your target, that you're, toward your allocation. And so I think that they do need to be included, but I also think that's kind of one of the reasons I feel like we're doing this development ready lands is that it's pretty commonly known that buildable lands inventories tend to overestimate capacity. And so this kind of demonstrates within your buildable lands that like there are some development ready lands, but maybe some can't be developed to capacity. So to me, that's very telling. And you can look at it and say, hey, I'm going to take these steps because that's one of sort of my actions is I want a higher capacity, right, on these lands. And it may not be able to at all. It might be restricted because of slopes or other, undevelopable areas. So that would be my first comment. I think that I was a little confused in the definitions by the definition of adjacent in this context, because if you look at number 2, it says it uses the term adjacent, and I don't understand how the definition of adjacent works with the definition under readily served. And I didn't see anywhere else in the rules that were using this term adjacent in this context of meaning facilities within 300 feet. So I was wondering if I missed something or if somebody could just take a look at that, because I'm not entirely sure why that definition is in there. And so I know I'm one of the ones that always talks, and I try to like get all my comments in really fast and let other people talk. So I will limit it to one more. When you get past the definitions under development ready land inventory on page 2. I think that I like that it's described as a subset of land identified in the buildable land inventory. And I think we just need to sort of use that throughout, because my concern is that something is getting lost in there potentially, or there's going to be an assumption that it's a different group of lands, because then it talks about the development ready land, identify parcels zoned to allow residential use that are serviced. Well, are those the same as in your BLI or not the same as in your BLI? I mean, I think we all know that they are, but the use of a different term implies they might not be. And then when you get down to number 2, it only references vacant and partially vacant land as one of your in your categories. But when you look at the definition in 197A 270 of buildable lands, it includes vacant lands, partially vacant lands, redevelopable lands. There's a couple other categories. I don't have it open in front of me. And I just want to make sure we're looking at apples and apples, because my assumption is you can use all of those different types of land in your BLI for your development ready lands. Like, I don't know why you wouldn't want to. And so just be careful to look at those sort of common threads and terms throughout. I'm going to stop there. Thank you for letting me chatter again.
Martha, you bring up some good points, and I just wanted to clarify one that's sort of, in my mind, sort of easy to address. One is that
Okay.
the relationship between adjacent and readily served is one that's part of statute. So the definition of development ready land, and I'll put it in the chat in just a second, says readily served through adjacent public facilities as the definition for what one of the qualifying criterion is. One qualifying criterion for development ready land is that it is readily served through adjacent public facilities. And so we do have to provide some reference for what those two words mean, adjacent in particular, because readily served implies that it is that service is available, and that is a relative term to a lot of different people.
And so that readily served definition is in statute, you said? Because you're creating a different.
Not, but the term is.
The term is, because the definition here doesn't reference readily served by whatever you said. I'm sorry, I was listening, by adjacent facilities. And so maybe it's that the readily served needs to be reworked so this reference to adjacent makes sense. And then the other pieces underneath it. So anyway, thank you for that clarification though.
Absolutely.
Great. And if others have thoughts on that, Maddie just dropped some language into the chat. Feel free to provide some comments in the chat too. Let's go to Heather, and good to see our folks who are going to have to do this work to hear your thoughts. Go ahead.
Thanks. So I just wanted to comment about the point that was just raised by Martha about how, so under development ready land inventory, number 2 doesn't talk about quantifying or enumerating development ready parcels that are redevelopment. And I'm just thinking later under sufficiency of development ready land, it's clear that we are allowed to count capacity that we're assuming on through redevelopment in development ready land inventory. And that's great, because I think that's going to be increasing over time. Presumably we would be seeing more redevelopment. So I do feel like, especially because of number 3 above in the land inventory, it says parcels that do not achieve these stated characteristics. And I'm not really sure what that's referring to, because it doesn't say in 1 or in 1-2 above, but it just says these characteristics shall not be considered development ready. I could potentially read that as that you couldn't count capacity on redevelopment as being part of your development ready land inventory, since you're not required to enumerate it in number 2. So I just mentioned that. I also wanted to mention about the achieved density versus minimum density. So I guess I kind of missed that last time that we had agreed, or that there had been general, and I know we're not going for consensus, but that folks wanted to not assume that, to not include, to include land that could meet the minimum density but wouldn't meet the achieved density that you would be assuming in your BLI. I'm not saying that I'm against that, but I do want to mention that that does require us to do the analysis twice. So the way we had talked about it before is, and I think the example that was shown is, you do your buildable lands inventory, you know the average capacity that you're assuming by plan designation, and then you add up the acreage and the capacity on that acreage that meets your development ready criteria. Boom, you're done. So it's like a subset of your BLI. But this would say, okay, now take that subset and determine what of it would, or sorry, now take the land that's not in that subset, that didn't make it into your development ready subset, the land that didn't meet the criteria, and say, well, actually, is there any of that that could meet the minimum density? So it's a different capacity analysis. So you're kind of doing two capacity analysis. So I think everyone's recognizing that, but that makes me a little bit worried, because that is not as streamlined as we talked about before. So I just wanted to mention that. I also have concerns with, in near term, that there's still the limit of 25% of projects can be on the financially constrained list. I don't know if we ended up talking about that last time, that limit. I don't remember, I didn't see it in my notes, but I'm just wondering, I'm assuming there was just a desire to put a limit on the amount that we could assume from your financially constrained list. And so we just went with 25% of your projects. But that worries me a little bit. If you don't have a lot of projects, then you might get into kind of an awkward situation where you only have 2 projects and you can only count one of them that's on the financially constrained list. And that doesn't seem ideal. Okay. And that's all I'm going to say. Oh, sorry, one more. And the 300-foot thing, I thought the reason we were using that is because a lot of jurisdictions use that as a threshold for if property can annex. And that typically, at least for us, if they're annexing, that means they're ready to develop. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, because if we make it shorter, then that means some land that we're identifying as ready to develop wouldn't be able to be counted as development ready. And so that seems like it could be a conflict. Okay, I'm done. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Let's go to you, Madeline, and then we're gonna need to move on to our next topic pretty soon here, so we'll go through the remaining hands. No, it's fine. And then we'll move on to our next topic. Go ahead, Madeline.
Just a quick rejoinder. Thank you, Heather, for those comments and for sharing your perspective. You raised some of the concerns that I also had, and thank you for also flagging redevelopment as an opportunity, something that could be noted earlier in the analysis so as to inform the sufficiency. I think that there are some places where we're trying to make parallels between the BLI, and Martha, to your point, to emphasize that this is a subset of the BLI. It's not something separate or independent from that. And I think what I want to focus everyone's attention on a little bit more finally is that it's not necessarily what is shown on the map, because what's shown on the map is what meets the statutory definition. And we know from practice and from discussion with many practitioners that property that doesn't show up on the map could develop, and that's not out of the ordinary. That's not something, any count that we do is imperfect, because we know that decisions that landowners make are not always rational, and sometimes there are good reasons why a property develops, even though it didn't register in this case to the definition of development ready. But what's critical is that when land doesn't register as development ready based on these minimum thresholds that we're setting, whether that be a minimum density or an achieved density, it's a call to the city to action. And by not identifying the land as development ready, it indicates that there's something about that area or those parcels that's out of balance, that there's land that's vacant, that's available, but it's not served, or it's served, or it's really far away from service, or there's some significant barrier that potentially a city has some level of opportunity to influence, whether that's through process, through incentives, through other things in their housing production strategy that could that could rebalance that scenario or that situation. And so it's not necessarily what's on the map and what comes up as whatever color a jurisdiction chooses, but rather what is the outcome of that and of that inventory. And I think we might all agree that the outcome of that inventory ought to show a city where it could make investments that might have significant yield or outcome, either to increase the capacity of land that is served, because maybe there's a lot of service and there's some vacancy or partial vacancy, and there's an opportunity, if only the zoning code allowed, for more density to be placed there. Vice versa, there's also instances where land is zoned to significant capacity, but the investment might need to be made in an area, some level of infrastructure, whether that be through organizing a financial approach or a cost sharing mechanism, among other things. So think about this is a call to action for a city to think about what its housing production strategy actions could look like, and how the outcome of the mapping itself informs that. So we could spend a lot of time thinking about the details here, and I appreciate everyone's perspective on it. And I hope that we keep that in the back of our minds of like, how can this help cities address those areas that have a deficiency because they can't meet the achieved density that we've assumed, for example. Go ahead, Damien. Thank you.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I had one question and then one comment. Under zone to allow, I wanted to confirm here that we're talking about more than just our residential plan designations, but this may include mixed use categories where a city has taken steps to allow all the types of housing they're going to need based on the OHNA. Okay, thank you for the nod of heads. Thank you. And then under readily served, under 2A, a request for defining or providing some examples for cost sharing mechanisms. Because I think that could include anything from development agreements, LIDs, improvement districts. I just want to make sure that there's a variety of examples that a city could look to and say, okay, we can do X, and that becomes part of their development ready analysis. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Damien. Just we'll go to Brock and then Martha quickly here and move on to our next topic. I also want to just remind people that the Miro board's always there to provide additional comments. I know Ted Reed had to drop out for another meeting, but he said he'd follow up with the Miro board, so I encourage others to do the same. Go ahead, Brock.
Yeah, just quickly on the 300 feet piece, and Heather, I totally get what you're saying, and that absolutely makes sense. I thought that the reason that 300 feet was used here was because of the recent DEQ sewer rule that was done in the last 6 months or so, or that concluded in the last few months. But I know that also like the part of the issue with that one was that there was a property that was like 200 and some feet, or like, 199 feet or whatever, from the connection point. And for that single lot or parcel, they had like a septic error, malfunction and they had to replace it or connect to the sewer. City told them they had to connect, and the connection was like $100,000+ whereas fixing the septic system would have been like 30 or something like that. The numbers aren't exact, but I know it was substantially higher for connecting to the sewer. I think there's something in there about the number of units that would be developed associated with that connection. So like if it's a single lot that you're developing that's already within, your city limits, right? It's annexed everything. Maybe that's 200 feet. And then if you're doing, 5+ units or 10+ units, that's when you can go to that 300 just from a cost impact standpoint on a per unit basis.
Thanks, Brock. Martha.
Yeah, so my understanding of that 300 feet is that it comes under, and I don't have the reference in front of me, this idea of you have to connect to sewer if it's legally and physically available. And in there is that 300-foot, but there's also this issue of being legally available. And so I don't have an issue with that, although I would encourage you to find that language and look at it and see if that term might be better used than just 300 feet. And so I had this little aha moment, like I understood what my glitch was with these two definitions. And I think what you're trying to say, Madeline, under number 2 is readily served means required improvements are adjacent to, and then that ties to the definition of adjacent to right below it. So maybe that's the fix, and then you get rid of the use of the term adjacent elsewhere in that definition, because it implies that the other definition would apply there. But I'm also wondering, you have offsite and oversized facilities highlighted in here, and I'm wondering, was there a question about that or some discussion that needed to happen? Because I have a little bit of a twitch about saying no offsite improvements are required, because there almost always are offsite improvements required with development.
Thanks for raising that. Those are highlighted. Thank you, Heather, for your comments in writing from several months ago. That inconsistency is still on the table related to distance. It all comes down to proportionality. The 300 feet, and thank you for citing a variety of sources that use that distance as a reference. The 300 feet is in many ways, I think we could understand this as a proxy for proportionality. This is how much distance or length of improvement of any particular utility, be it sewer, water, street, that needs to be extended in order for the development to be viable. And many cities use, and DEQ uses, among others, 300 feet as a distance for a single family lot to be required to connect to sewer if it's legally available. Thank you for those definitions. That said, there are very few standards like this that are available to us to draw from. That one happened to be an available one that I'm familiar with from my previous work. And I'm hoping that in some way we can maintain some consistency. I just saw Casera mention that in her work in clean water services, so a lot of the utility providers, special districts might use this in their definitions. I know I've referenced it from our public works design standards that I used in a previous job. And so there are a number of folks in that field that likely use the same standard. And so I'm hoping to maintain some consistency there. Just a quick note that that Heather, you had mentioned the 25% of the financially constrained list, and this is the numbers certainly can be changed. That's up for discussion, and I just wanted to mention that that's a backstop to the potential of with, for lack of better terminology, a bad actor who says we're going to accommodate that we can accommodate this much development ready land to meet our target. It's 40%, and the rest will be provided through redevelopment without any substantial verification or validation of that, either through projects or other ways. And there was just a level of concern that we had that could be misused if not given some kind of governance a limitation on the number of projects that could be assumed to be performed in that 6 or 8 year time frame. So we'll continue discussion on that. Thank you everyone for your input on the version 2 here, and I'll let Steve take it away for our next topic.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Good discussion. Karin is now going to talk about some of the aspects of partially vacant land and redevelopable land. You're on mute, Karin.
Well, that should help a little bit. Thanks. So I'll briefly overview some of the refinements that we did based on our discussions with you all. So if we go into our next slide, these are the discussion questions. So this is what we hope to gauge today with you all is the revisions that you see in draft rule language, and mostly in the definitions and a few other pieces. There's some rule concepts in there that aren't quite in draft rule language yet. But does that reflect what you all have been sharing, what you're hearing? Additionally, are there considerations that you want us to move forward as we continue to refine our approach for the application of a land market supply factor, and how we would utilize that in the housing capacity analysis? All right, next slide. So just a reminder that our buildable lands inventory is part of the larger housing capacity analysis. And today we're talking about partially vacant land, redevelopable land, how that gets inventoried, and then the assessment of capacity and any market factors to reduce that estimate of capacity. So really quickly, the next slide, I actually might not read this slide at all. So you have in your memo, I think page 2, what we heard from you all, and what informed some of the revisions that you're seeing on page 3 and 4 of your memo. So let's move right into that, starting off with the definition of redevelopable land. And it was a very minor, this is consistent from development ready land, removing zone for residential use and replacing that with zone to allow for residential use. So that should be consistent. In our next slide, partially vacant land. So we've refined the definition based on your feedback, and you'll see where we've just tweaked the language a little bit to read partially vacant land. Refers to buildable lots with existing development on it, where the land area can be further developed within the applicable development regulations. And I will say we took feedback from members of the CowTAC and members of the RAC. So the RAC got to see this language last week on Wednesday, so we incorporated that as well. Next, we'll move into sort of a concept. I do not have rule language for you today, and you'll notice in your memo, this is the concept that we're working on. We have some GIS specialists. We heard from you all that in rules or in any concepts that we create, that it should be automated, and preferably that GIS tools could be used to apply any requirements in rule around inventorying partially vacant in the buildable land inventory. And so we're working on what possible safe harbor could we provide for partially vacant land. And we have come to a few parameters. So we'll discuss this a little bit more with you all, but the parameters around what density or where we go with low density, medium or moderate density, and then high density, and how does that apply to what is considered partially vacant. It seems a lot more practical to operationalize in your low density plan designations, somewhere around 10 dwelling units per acre. That's up for discussion, but it makes sense there. And then minimum lot sizes, or I'm sorry, parcels or lots that are twice the minimum lot size. It makes sense to count those or inventory those as partially vacant. And then it makes sense when you're looking at that plan designation for low density, when you're looking at that lot size in comparison to the minimum lot size. Well, what if there's already development on there? That certainly can't be accounted for as capacity for future development. And so subtracting a quarter acre is pretty consistent with what we have in rules today. I think next we'll go into, so once you've inventoried, you understand the definition of your partially vacant. We're working on a safe harbor for what that would look like for identifying and inventorying. And then you've inventoried all your partially vacant and you want to take some market factor reductions. Like, I don't believe all of this capacity will develop within the 20-year planning horizon. So what does that look like? So we've provided this optional land market supply factor in addition to a safe harbor. Should a safe harbor be there to say, well, it's safe to say that about 10% of your residential capacity on partially vacant land may not develop. And so there's a safe harbor choice, or if you want to take a larger discount, then you will provide the analysis and show your work and be able to demonstrate that. So with these refinements, what is left that we've heard from you? And if we go to the next slide, we've articulated what we've heard from you all and other folks, interested parties around, well, what do we need in guidance? We need a little bit more around examples for doing this inventory, methodologies for assessing redevelopment. Can we see different methodologies and how they're used and what their outcomes are? Methodologies for using the market factor. What are my market factors that go into incorporated land versus unincorporated land in my UGB? And how do we estimate the deductions? And how do we provide good, acceptable, quantifiable validation? What examples are out there? What does the department want to see? So I think that summarizes the rule changes we've shared with you. It summarizes where additional documentation might go for guidance and materials and resources around guidance. And I think, let's see, Steve, I think we're going to do the straw poll and then invite folks to engage in those discussion questions. And I'll put the discussion questions in the chat.
You got it. Ingrid, please pull up the poll. We've got 9 people, 10. I think that's about right. And most of them are 2s with 1 3, but no 1s. Darn it. Let's hear from our 2s and 3s. And again, encouraging people who maybe everyone voted a 2 or a 3, so everybody's got something to say. And I just want to encourage those who maybe haven't commented as often to please raise your hand and get in the queue. Just want to make sure I'm seeing all the.
I'm going to be really rude and jump in one more thing. Should we run out of time, if that happens, the mirror board is live. And I might just go put that in the chat right now. If we don't get to your comment today, please feel free to just add that to the mirror board. And we'll keep that open, I think, for a full week.
All right, lots to talk about. Brock, go ahead.
Yeah, and I was a 3, but again, arguably a 2. I think the definition portions are good as far as the safe harbor and the land market supply factor. So reading the background memo that Beth put together, it's showing that in Washington, the average land market supply factor for vacant land was between 7 and 37%, and for essentially partially vacant land was between 9 and 55%. Just because of that, I feel like the safe harbor being 10% is probably too low. I kind of just did some, back of the envelope math to try to come up with something that I think is a little bit more meaningful. Well, first, I think it should apply to vacant land as well. And I do think that this should be something that every city has to do. But when we get into that safe harbor percentage, between 7 and 37, right? That's a range of 30. Half of that's 15. If you go 7 with the 15, 22%. Similarly, if you did that same kind of math for vacant land or for partially vacant land, then it's a little bit larger. 9% is the low, 55 is the high. That gives you a difference of about 23, range of 46. 23 plus that 9 gives you 32. So I think 22 and 32, if we want to do round numbers, 20 and 30, or, a third and a quarter. But I think something like that is important. But as far as the vacant land piece too, I do think that's really important because I have not heard a single person in this TAC state that all vacant land is going to develop over the planning period. I think we all know that that's not necessarily accurate, and I think that's reflected in what Washington's doing by showing that the land supply market factor there is a little bit lower, right? But it does still exist. So I think that's important to consider, and I'm happy to share like the draft language that I worked up for it too with the staff team.
Thanks, Brett. Cotton?
Thank you. Yeah, I'm actually going to bring in one other voice into the conversation. And I know I'm cutting the queue here, but Al Johnson was not able to be here today. He has provided his comments. I have shared that now with the TAC. It is part of the public record. So if you all are interested in what Al would have shared had he been here, you have that now link. But Steve, I'll hand that over to you now.
Okay. Cassara.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because I agree with what Brock said. I like the approach for the safe harbor. I just was getting a little caught up on the thresholds and whether those were the right amounts. And then for the governments with population over 25,000, I also just wanted to make sure that it's not residential zone, but it's in areas that allow residential uses. I know that's still under works, but just wanted to double check.
Thanks, Cassara. I think it's important to remember this is a new concept. So even the idea of allowing some of this market factor or the discounted threshold are kind of new concepts. So appreciate people's thoughts on that. Sam.
Yeah, just sort of adding not much, but just pretty much gonna copy what Brock said there, but specific to Portland and our BLI for both vacant and partially vacant, we treat our vacant supply as anything sort of less than 80% constrained. So we use a sort of 20% threshold and discount anything that's more constrained than that. So I would support revisiting that threshold. I think then on the safe harbor that you're working on, the sort of, I guess, a clarifying question would be on bullets 2 and 3, where you've got for lots with existing development that are at least 2 times the minimum lot size. We've got a lot of 10,000 square foot lots, for example, in the West Hills that are highly constrained. They're probably not going to redevelop or develop further than they are currently, but that they are twice our minimum lot size of 5,000 feet. A quarter acre is also more than 10,000 square foot, right? If we do the math on that, it's about 12,000. So I guess the math ain't mathing a little bit, and I'm just wondering if there is some further clarification on how that might work.
Yeah, it gets tricky when your low density zone is a minimum lot size of 5,000 square feet. That's where it doesn't really match up. In that, there's only a few jurisdictions. You might be among very few peers where our low density designated has a minimum lot size of 5,000. So that is something we'll have to consider on how that would work. I think for the constrained piece, for cities who have low density zones and they have parcels or lots that are twice the minimum lot size, but much of it is constrained, you can remove the constrained portions out. And I think the tricky part here then is where that development is situated. And when you're subtracting the quarter acre for the existing development, what's left, we know that not all lots are left with a significant portion of say contiguous developable land. And so that's where the market factor would come in. that not everything you inventory, even under these parameters as partially vacant, will develop. And therefore you utilize the market factor to sort of even that out and say, well, here's the deduction or how much we'll reduce the capacity based on that. But Sam, I might follow up with you one-on-one just to figure it, because yeah, I'm very familiar with Portland zoning and it's going to be tricky to figure that out for you all. So let's follow up. There's also, remind me if I don't remember to follow up with you on that threshold for the market factor versus Portland's threshold with constrained, that 20% constrained versus unconstrained. So let's follow up and connect. Thanks.
Beth, did you have something you wanted to jump in on?
Yeah, briefly on what I think it was Casera, although the name escapes me now because it was 5 seconds ago, said about applying more broadly than residentially zoned land. For partially vacant, I would say that I wouldn't necessarily expect it to apply in the same way to commercial, because the way you're looking at commercial land ends up being so substantially different than the way you look at residentially zoned land. So the capacity in commercial in most cities, and I'll say Portland is almost certainly a difference here. But in most cities is just different because you're not counting all of your commercial land as developable for housing, because obviously all commercial land doesn't do that. So you're counting a subset of commercial land. And so I haven't gone back and thought about your comment in the context of that, but I just wanted to follow up on that difference.
Thanks, Beth. Mary Kyle.
So sorry, I feel like there's so many concepts pinging around. Sorry if this is really dumb, but I am trying to figure out if these relate. If not, if we're talking about the land supply market factor, if I understand, for partially vacant land, correct?
We're talking about, yeah, that concept and a potential safe harbor for partially vacant land as well.
Now, how does that relate, if at all, to what we were just talking about in terms of assessing the capacity, how we assess the capacity of land for development readiness of achieved versus minimum? And do these start stacking and we're double that discounting land? And maybe my brain is just like in the wrong box here, or I put too many things in the same box.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Thanks, Steve.
Karen says everything's a good question, but I know that might not be. I'm just getting confused. I'm getting confused.
We as staff are really practicing, and it's been a few months. Practicing for a few months on how to differentiate your goal 10 work to the work that is applicable in your goal 14 analysis.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go for it because I think it was a good question. It gives me an opportunity to practice.
Okay, thanks.
But yes, so goal 10 requires you to do a housing capacity analysis and determine if you have sufficient capacity. If you do not have sufficient capacity, you are required to take actions, whether efficiency measures or a UGB amendment or both.
Right.
When you're doing that, there's a brand new thing. There's a brand new landscape we're working within goal 10 that's called the Housing Production Strategy Program.
Mm-hmm.
And somehow we have to figure out what are the actions within that strategy to create more capacity. And that housing capacity or that housing production strategy, it does not have any bearing on your goal 14 analysis of whether or not you need a UGB amendment.
Right.
And so that's where we start to split, that you do the HCA and the BLI, and you determine if you can do enough efficiency measures to accommodate the needed housing, or do I also need a UGB? And it kind of goes that way.
Yeah.
And then your cities above 10,000 will be required to do also their development ready land inventory. And it says, well, I have this land available, but not all of it development ready. This is what I have annexed within my city. How do I create more development ready land? You can annex more land in, and you can create opportunities for it to be more readily available, the likelihood of increase the likelihood of development. And the way you're going to do that is to take actions through your production strategy.
Right.
So that's where you end up with these two roads of, I'm going to take measures and I may need to do a UGB amendment. but I can also take these other actions and measures, and that becomes part of my production strategy to create more development readiness, the likelihood that this land will develop. So we are bifurcating. I'm going to find a really quick way to say that in like a 30-second elevator speech. I'm just not there yet.
That was pretty good.
But if you have partially vacant land and it's zoned for 6 to 10 units per acre, and you're going to assume it either has a minimum, it's going to achieve a minimum density of 6 or let's take the 515, minimum density of 5 or the achieved density of 10. But then we're also going to use a land supply market factor to discount its capacity in some way. That's where I'm getting a little confused.
Yeah, so Beth, I'm going to turn to you because we inventory all the partially vacant. We estimate the achieved density in the designated plan designations. And then after we do that, we will apply a land market supply factor to the partially vacant inventory and estimates.
I think this is for the 20-year buildable land supply. I think not the 6 or 8 year development ready land
And
supply.
that's the only place where the minimum versus
Only
achieved. Okay. Because otherwise it sounds like double discounting. Okay. Got it, Beth. Okay. Thank you.
Karen agrees. Ethan agrees. We're all on the same page. Okay. If that was your question, Mary Kyle, we'll go to Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I had two comments. So under the new 2 for allowing a local government to use a reasonable land market supply factor, I would request some kind of reference to goal 2 under this language so that it's clear. We're talking about a reasonable person could come to the same conclusion as a city in looking at the data that we're using. And then under partially vacant land, I know there is some discussion under the definition about legal lots of record, and I wanted to refer to ORS 920106, which is a definition for, I think, lawfully created units of land, which is a lot of syllables more than just lots, but wanted to offer that for context in terms of capturing all units of land created through either a subdivision, a partition, through the recording of some kind of legal instrument, or some other process that a city might use. I think Deschutes County had a situation a few years ago where they had relied on their issuance of building permits to recognize a property as a legal lot of record. And I think LUBA concluded that they couldn't do that. And I may be paraphrasing it inaccurately, but I wanted to offer that for the definition of partially vacant land without making it unnecessarily wordy. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. We'll look at that. Martha. You're on mute, Martha.
Sorry. Like I said, you think I know how to use it by now. I have a clarifying question about 2A, the safe harbor. I like the idea of having a safe harbor, but the way I read it is that 10% is a discount. So in other words, you have to assume 90% of your partially vacant land develops. Am I misunderstanding that?
Correct.
Okay. So I think what Brock was saying is that instead of 90%, the number should be 20 to 30%. Is that?
That's my understanding.
Or was the discount 20 to 30%,
The
Brock?
discount, right, Brock?
Yeah, discount is what I was thinking, and that was just
Okay.
based on the background memo that had the 2 ranges.
That's totally fine. I don't have a strong feeling about what that number is. 10% seems a little high to me. If you're looking at all of your partially vacant lands that meet these sort of like minimum qualifications, just because there's more land available, I feel like getting that land to be redeveloped can be kind of hard. I mean, and I guess that's where you get to your land market supply factor instead, if you don't want to use just the safe harbor. But I guess I would maybe base that safe harbor on something like the studies that he's talking about, because this discounted 10% seems maybe like not enough to me. And then I just had a comment about, or some thoughts about this safe harbor for identifying partially vacant land. I don't necessarily disagree with the 2 times the minimum lot size because you're just looking at the whole inventory, but that's where it gets important to understand how much of that you can discount. I feel like this subtracting a 1/4 acre for the existing dwelling would get rid of a lot of this land because some of the land is zoned to allow for 5, 7, 8,000 square foot lots. So maybe it's just, subtracting the equivalent of the minimum lot size for the existing dwelling, or that's not the right exact words, but something like that might be a little bit more practical across the different jurisdictions. And then I'm curious why only low density plan designations of less than 10 dwelling units an acre would fall under the safe harbor. I mean, quite frankly, I don't think there's any zoning districts anymore that are less than 10 dwelling units an acre because we have to allow middle housing in nearly all of them. And so that one confused me a little bit.
Maybe we'll go to Conan. Do you want to respond to that question, and then we'll go to Beth?
Yeah, Betsy, help me out, please. And then honestly, we took a lot of this from Beth's work and seeing, I think in the low density residential designations, those low, maybe a little bit in moderate, what you're seeing is those large lot parcels with an existing dwelling unit. So when they're at the minimum lot size and having a dwelling unit, it's been less likely to see those redevelop. And I even say that with hesitancy because I feel like, Beth, it depends on the market value. You're seeing homes of high value on these large lots, and they certainly do have the potential for middle housing, but the likelihood of middle housing, we just don't have that data. We don't know if twice the minimum lot size with a high value home is going to give you partially vacant capacity for future, more intense residential uses. And you're right, Martha, maybe in the coming years, we'll have that data and say, oh, we're seeing so much middle housing in these partially vacant lots. It just, we don't have the experience and data to show that at the time. And then Beth, you also had some experience looking at those low density designation areas and the pattern of infill for those.
So a few thoughts. I think partially vacant is evolving because of middle housing. It's always been the thing that is hardest in the BLI that people have the most argument over, that reasonable people have the most argument over. And it's not the big pieces of partially vacant land. Like one of our RAC members talked about, a 30-acre piece of land that had a farmhouse on it. That would technically be partially vacant. And I would not be able to get up in front of a city council and say, no more development on that land because it's got a house. My face would, turn very, very red. It's when you get down to the smaller parcels that, you start having, I think, really reasonable disagreements. And it's especially when you get down to the smaller parcels, say, that are on hillsides. And, this is more outside of, Portland. I'm going to say Portland is a different beast in a lot of ways than most of the rest of our state. And so I think one reason to look at low density is because what middle housing is doing and what some types of multifamily housing are doing, especially when you start getting things like detached duplexes or other types of detached plexes, which confused me to no end for a long time until I understood what they were. Once you start getting into that more, and you're definitely there on some types of low density in some communities, but especially once you get to medium and high density, and commercial is a whole different sort of thing when you think about partially vacant in a lot of ways. And so I think trying to target where partially vacant is more of a thing that is reasonably argued about is one of the reasons to look at lower density zones. And it may well be that what you should do is look at lower density zones where single family housing is allowed at the densities under discussion, like lower than 10 dwelling units an acre, or whatever the threshold is. The reason for the market factor, I think everybody's intuitively grasping, which is that not all land will develop over a 20-year period. That's one of the ways in which I've long personally thought, my opinion, is that Washington did something that was smarter than Oregon in that way, and acknowledging that. In talking to my colleagues who are helping Washington rethink how their buildable lands program works and do their guidebook, it's become very apparent that a lot of the analysis that a city could reasonably do without a lot of expense and extra work is not necessarily analysis that's going to be really high quality analysis. And so I'm kind of personally hoping that there is at least some safe harbor. And if a city wants to go above that safe harbor and they can do an analysis that is defensible, then perhaps that would be allowed also.
Thanks, Beth. I was just going to mention that there is that opportunity for cities if they want to exceed those safe harbor. Corey.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to stay off camera. I'm a little under the weather today. But I think one of the questions that I had for staff was just how accurate those ranges have proved to be, you know, the land supply market factor. And, you know, there's a pretty broad stance there, I would say. And I think what we heard back, and staff can correct me, is that, you know, Washington really couldn't prove that up, right? They weren't really sort of, you know, keeping track of how accurate those ranges were over time, what percentage seemed the most accurate, and then related what sort of assumptions, right? The things that were going into inform that land supply market factor, what was proving to be the most accurate over time. And so I think when I look at those ranges, I have a slightly different reaction than what other folks have shared on this call, which is that those are just ranges that Washington has been trying. There hasn't been sort of a plethora of data to show us what's accurate or not. And so for me, when I look at how the rules are written, and I see that 10%, that seems like a reasonable safe harbor to me for partially vacant land. And so some of the points that Beth just raised, if folks want to go above and beyond and cite their work, that makes sense to me. And I think just a recognition that this is one of the bigger changes that we've all been talking about and considering in our work together. And so I think for me, it's great to have an example and look at sort of lessons learned from other places, but I do feel like a more measured approach here is appropriate. Thanks.
Thanks, Corey. And I think kind of Beth's comments were getting a little bit to what you said about the Washington experience that, that we don't know how those have proved to be over time. And Beth, if you want to chime in later with any further information, feel free. Brock?
Yeah, and well, one, I think we don't know how effective redevelopment has been in a lot of situations either, because we don't have any math on how that pencils out, but we still count it. So I think it is reasonable to use a higher threshold there. But I do just want to touch on the fact that I do think this should be mandatory, because even if you're in an area where, you know, let's say Portland again, right, there's really nowhere for your UGB to expand. If you're using that land supply market factor, let's say that you have, you know, 100 buildable acres that you think are in your BLI, right? And you're doing a 20% reduction. Well, maybe that means that in Portland, you need to upzone a little bit more, right, to offset that difference. So I think it is a useful tool that everyone should be using, regardless of, I don't think it should be an optional tool. I think it should be something that you're required to use.
Thanks, Brock. I might be wrong about this, but I feel like that's the first time where people have advocated for less flexibility rather than more flexibility, but I might be wrong about that. Conan, any comments to wrap up this topic before we close?
Yeah, if I could have the last word as a request. So we have on the table discussion around, is 10% the right safe harbor? Is it not? We have questions around why for low density zones, you know, are partially vacant safe harbor. We don't have a safe harbor yet. We have a rule concept. We'll work on that and refine. So we'll bring back with version 3. But if there's any parameters you want to add or any refinement you want to add for a safe harbor for identifying partially vacant. And we have sort of these new proposals. I heard this at RAC last week. There were RAC members of, you know, is the 10% the right percentage? Should it be optional or should it be mandatory to use? I don't know of any states that mandate a land market supply factor. I do not believe it's mandated in California. I know it's not mandated in Washington. So all of that is on the table, and we're gonna go back and work on version 3. So please use the Miro board. share with us your thoughts and feedback. We'll take that all into consideration. And just to reiterate, we're not looking for consensus. We will come with version 3 based on integrating your input, and we'll work through those versions in refinement.
Thanks, Kevin. So we got a fair amount of ones and twos on development ready lands, not so much on our partially vacant land, but I feel we're still making progress. And thanks for your comments today that are getting us closer to our goal. Our next meeting, be warned, is scheduled for Thursday, July 3rd. That is the next contact meeting date. We're going to be talking about urban growth boundaries, both in terms of, urban growth boundary expansion areas, both in terms of housing affordability and complete neighborhoods. You may remember that was one of our last conversations before we took our break. So we want to get back into that. And then the next RAC meeting is on July 9th. I think the topic for that is to be determined. Staff can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I don't think we know what the topic's going to be yet. But we did have a nice conversation with them, I think last week. So it's interesting to bring the topics that you all talk about and bring those to RAC and get some feedback and then bring it back to you. So with that, I think we are good for today. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you in a few weeks.
Wait.
Oh.
Show of hands. Who's going to the next rodeo?
Oh, sorry, my bad.
All right, thank you all. I'll poll you guys each time.
Bye.
Okay.